Yesterday, Senator Rand Paul introduced an amendment to remove Dr. Anthony Fauci as director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. Paul deemed Fauci a dictator-in-chief who imposed lockdowns that caused an economic disaster, referencing the Johns Hopkins study that showed lockdowns did more harm than good when it came to stopping the spread. Fauci has been the head of the NIAID since 1984.
In an op-ed for Fox News, the senator proposed dividing Fauci's position into 3 separate new institutes led by a director with a 5-year term to create accountability into a position that has, quote, largely abused its power. Political reporter at The Hill, Julia Manchester, and culture editor at The Federalist, Emily Jashinsky, are with us to weigh in on Senator Paul's amendment. Hello, welcome to the show. So starting off with you, Emily, what do you think about this idea? I mean, you know, Fauci's like, what, 80-something years? In his 80s, he's been the head of the NIH for a really long time. So what do you think of Senator Paul's amendment to break it up and to have a 5-year term?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the problems are clearly deeper than Fauci. You know, again, we can't set aside how dramatically, I think, his leadership, dramatically negatively, his leadership affected the response to the lockdowns. That's, of course, true. But what we saw is that with this lumbering bureaucracy, there were so many problems that went beyond Fauci anyway. And so I think, at least directionally, Rand Paul saying we're going to look at the structural changes that need to happen here is really smart. It's also really interesting to note that Fauci has sort of just finally faded into the background, presumably on the wishes of the Biden administration. But it has been over the last few weeks really interesting to see how he suddenly went from being on every show that he could, you know, that would take him basically to fading completely into the background. And I think that's very telling.
Yeah, Julia, you know, I think it's interesting that for all the Republican anger directed at Anthony Fauci and, you know, to some degree the CDC, public health officials in general, you haven't seen an actual major legislative push, really, to do anything about it. Is this just another case of, you know, Republicans talk about a culture war, but it's just something they talk about? They don't actually legislate, and they don't make any claims to legislate. So Paul's actually putting something on the table, but I don't know that the GOP has any interest in doing something.
Yeah, I think you're going to hear critics of this idea from Rand Paul essentially saying this, and also pointing out that Rand Paul has a history of engaging in back and forths with Dr. Fauci, you know, on television during these hearings. It seems like it's some must-see TV for people watching, you know, for those who hate Dr. Anthony Fauci and those who love him. But, you know, I think it's interesting. I think you are going to see a lot of experts, a lot of lawmakers looking at what went wrong during the coronavirus pandemic, what they could have done better, what went right. And I think this is going to essentially be a bit of an autopsy of how this was handled. You know, I think defenders of Anthony Fauci, defenders, you know, of the CDC's response would say, look, this was a virus that no one really knew about. They were essentially learning as they went along. While critics would definitely say that there was a control factor here, and lockdowns were harmful to a degree. So, you know, this is, I think, politicized to an extent on both sides, but we would be remiss to not talk about Rand Paul's history with Dr. Fauci here.
Yeah, and Rand Paul's also the only member of the GOP to hold out on the anti-Iran deal letter, saying to Biden, quote, condemning a deal that is not yet formulated is akin to condemning diplomacy itself, not a very thoughtful position. And that's hard to argue with, Emily. So why is that not the universally held opinion on the Republican side here?
Oh, wow, that was a hard pivot.
I just do what the prompter tells me.
I wanted to talk about how term limits could actually increase the revolving door problem, because, I mean, it's true that Fauci's sort of clubbiness, you can see it in the leaked emails and the FOIA emails, and The Intercept has done a lot of good reporting on this. It could make it worse. So that's one final point. To this next question, I think absolutely there's grounds in this case, given that the deal, there's a prior deal that essentially is trying to be revived. And so I actually do understand it more in this case. Generally, I would be with Senator Paul on this, that he's sort of standing against the posturing. But I think it's pretty clear what the administration's goals are, given that they are, quite explicitly trying to revive a deal that existed in the past. So I do see the grounds for the criticism at that point.
Yeah, what do you make of it, Julia? I think it harkens back to a time, I don't know how many years ago now, many years ago, where Rand Paul was, he didn't like Trump at the beginning, or he criticized Trump when he was running against him. He used to be someone in, I think, somewhat better standing with the media. He was looked to as an interesting leader of a sort of ideologically libertarian or small government contingent, the Tea Party wing, whatever you want to call it, within the Republican Party. Now I think he's perceived more as being just one of the many very conservative senators or something like that. But this is a reminder of a time where he would buck the Republican Party in a way that would get him some appreciation. So I thought that was interesting. What is your take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a bit of a reminder of that time. But at the same time, I think Rand Paul and even President Trump to an extent, on Capitol Hill. So, with a lot of these, this posturing, these statements that come out, I don't think it's entirely surprising. I think, Rand Paul is probably taking a number of different factors into account here, and maybe taking a more forward-looking approach, seeing how the deal could potentially develop, maybe how, whether it does stand to be developed at this point. We have to remember this has to do with energy, and it is an authoritarian government. And we're hearing, this might be getting a bit off track, but, I'd be remiss to not talk about, obviously, the Biden administration sanctions on Russia, Russian oil. And then, of course, we have talk of the Biden administration potentially relying or starting to rely on Venezuelan oil, for example. So I think when it comes to energy and these foreign governments, we're sort of entering into unknown territory here. And I think, lawmakers are very cognizant of that.
And Emily, because we weren't completely done with Fauci, I do want to ask, is there...
We never are.
We never are. But are how done with him are Republicans? Does he have the same heat around him that he had, say, 3 or 4 months ago? Is he firing base voters up just as much, or as we transition? Yeah, I'm genuinely curious, because you have your finger much more on the pulse of that than I do.
My suspicion is that absolutely 100% yes, he will never go away as a lightning rod, because these last 2 years were genuinely very traumatic for the country as a whole, and he became the very symbol. I think he's just sort of that indelible symbol of the excesses, especially on the right. The way that he said, if you criticize me, you're criticizing science itself. He embodied so perfectly and so visibly. He was on TV every single day. There were new clips every single day. The sort of hubris of, these insulated bureaucrats that so rankle people on the right, and I think some people in the middle too. So I actually think, Fauci could retire, but he will never not be an intense lightning rod, and the kind of lightning rod that gives Republicans a sort of template to tap into and say, this is what people despise, and sort of try to strategize that with their messaging and say, how else can we replicate and tap into that intense fury that exists over Fauci in other cases.
Well, I'm glad that Ryan brought it back to Fauci, because I wasn't done with him either on this. But I'm one that believes, the guy made a lot of mistakes, maybe even intentionally, should be held accountable for that. But I'm curious if you think that going after these government workers for their decision making, if that is going to create, if you think, and I'll start with you, Julia, if you think this is going to create a better society. We see other societies that do hold their government officials accountable, and they'll even jail them they'll really go after
Hell
him.
yeah, jail him.
Yeah. So, but then I wonder.
Robbie just went full lock her up.
Right. And that's kind of my point there is, does this actually create a better society? Would we be going in the right direction if we said, look, these people that are, because a lot of me says, yes, of course, we need to hold them accountable. They're the government workers that, or politicians who, get rich in office or take advantage of their position of power, and so they should be held accountable. A lot of me thinks that, but then part of me thinks, yeah, but do we really want to become one of these countries that just throws political opponents into jail because it could be abused, of course? So is it better to go after him, or is it better to say, the best thing to do is not to go after him legally, but instead just say term limits, get him out of office. We need to have, different checks and balances on our political class and on our government workers. What do you think?
Well, I think we have to look at what kind of precedents this would send and what going after him means. If you're going after, a government official legally, and, there's certainly precedent for that in the past, that's one scenario. But, I think term limits is something that, will be floated going forward. And it's not just Anthony Fauci where we talk about, term limits. We also talk about shorter term limits, the idea of shorter term limits being floated for U.S. senators, for example. There's sometimes the debate floated as to whether Supreme Court justices should be term limited. These are all ideas that are floated, and it all has to do with that revolving door and potentially whether we can get some sort of balance here.
Yeah. Emily, what do you think?
I think if people break the law, they should be treated equally, regardless of whether they're Anthony Fauci or some person in Cleveland. And so, if Anthony Fauci broke the law and there's sufficient evidence of it, there should be a legal pursuit of it, because he was in a position of vast power over the course of the last 2 years, and he should be held accountable. So the legal route, of course, I think, of course, take the legal route to the extent that there are actual legal avenues to litigate whether or not he broke the law. Then by all means, they should be pursued, because that's also a message to other sort of unelected bureaucrats that they can't get away with that.
And Emily, maybe this is how the left gets Republicans on board for repealing qualified immunity.
This is it.
Yeah,
sorry, police unions. This is called the Anthony Fauci qualified immunity.
Yes. I settle for making it much easier to fire public employees. That's what we really want. And qualified immunity gets in the way. And the right needs to embrace that. But Julia, Emily, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, Batya Ungar-Sargon joins us next to discuss the elite class's guilt trip on gas prices. Stay with us.